Hello, my name's Connor Williams. I'm a PhD student at the University of Nottingham. My thesis is on lordships in the 14th and early 15th century, looking at their political, social and economic importance. I'm currently working with Glyn Dwr and Peter Russell on this, and my paper today will be looking at the Mortimers at Usk from about 1369 through to the end of the Glyn Dwr rebellion. Basically looking at how they came to acquire the castle and the wider lordship connected to it, and also looking at their uses of it as a residence, construction work that they completed here, and damage that was actually done during the rebellion, which destroyed the economic output of Usk almost irrevocably after 1405, basically. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Thanks to the Mortimer History Society and the Friends of Usk Castle for inviting me to talk today. So as has already been alluded to, I'm going to be looking at how Usk came into the ownership of the Mortimer family, what it looked like in the later 14th century, so kind of dovetailing quite nice with what Kirsten's done, looking at how the lordship and its administration kind of evolved at this period, and looking at the decline of Usk, unfortunately, which happens along with the wider marches at this time due to the infamous Glyn Dwr rebellion. So little overview, so you all know where you are, because I'm sure you're all thinking about lunch at this stage. Starting off with the Mortimer story, what's going on with them, then looking at the castle, then looking at how the Mortimers used Usk, primarily as a residence, as income, how they interact with the locals around there as well, and construction work as well. I know Will said that it's possible that the Mortimers might have added to the construction of the castle at this time as well, and I'm going to be looking at the work of John Kenyon, who says that this might have been the case, and then going through the Glyn Dwr rebellion. So I'm going to start with the situation in 1327, basically. So what happens is, as we've alluded to, Edward II sees quite a dramatic fall from grace. His favourite, Hugh Despenser, is killed. He's dispatched in rather grisly manner, and the invading army, led by Isabella and Roger Mortimer, the first Earl, basically sweep in and take over the rule of the realm in the name of the young Edward III, basically. And for the next 3 years after that, Roger Mortimer is quasi-ruler of England, pulling the strings around the back, in the background, and really doing this. He's basically aggrandising himself and basically becoming the premier baron within the realm. He takes the ostentatious title as Earl of March, which caused quite a stink at the time, and he basically really annoys Edward by doing this. So what ends up happening to Mortimer is he has his own very dramatic fall from grace, and he basically gets surprised in a palace queue at Nottingham. Ironic, coming from Nottingham. So Edward III and some of his friends, so William Montague, who becomes Earl of Salisbury, and a load of his other friends, basically surprise Mortimer in the bedchamber of Isabella, and they capture him, and then about a month later he's executed, and all of his lands are forfeit, unfortunately. And unfortunately, you might think, well, that might be that, because obviously the Despenser family, who also kind of went through a massive aggrandisement at this time, never really reached the same peaks again throughout the entire 14th and 15th century. But the Mortimers did not suffer this fate because of this man, Roger Mortimer, the second Earl of March, and there is a brilliant biography by Matt Raven in the second volume of the Mortimer History Society journal, who goes through his life. And he basically sets about restoring the inheritance. So he has a difficult time of it. So his father, he's the grandson of the more famous Roger Mortimer. His father Edmund dies in 1331, and he's just managed to reclaim Wigmore, obviously the main seat of the Mortimers at this time. But then this Roger Mortimer, the second Earl, goes through a retracted wardship. So obviously something which I'm very interested in. and he is in the custody of his mother, who has married one of the king's men, Sir William, I think it's William, William Boone, who becomes Earl of Northampton, and he assists Roger in basically reconstructing his inheritance, and he kind of brings Roger within the king's grace. So Roger Mortimer is knighted in 1346 at the age of 17 or 18, and then he goes over to France during the famous Battle of Crécy, and he participates in that. And when he comes back, he's one of the king's new, famed commanders, despite the fact he's only 18. So a little bit of technical detail here. Wardships technically end when you're 21, that's considered the age of majority, but Edward sees fit to let him enter in the limited inheritance he has, and he then starts reclaiming a lot of his land. So in 1348, he receives his first summon to Parliament as the Baron Mortimer of Wigmore. He's one of the first inductees into the Order of the Garter. He reclaimed some of his lordships at Radnor, but he's really on the rise at this stage. But the greatest rewards were waiting for him in the 1350s. So in 1354, he managed to get the judgment against his grandfather quashed, and he's able to reclaim the title Earl of March. And he basically he manages to reclaim his dramatic inheritance, which his grandfather managed to create during his lifetime. He also takes up a bunch of senior positions within royal government as well. So he's warden of Dover Castle and the Cinque Ports. He becomes one of Edward's main generals during the 100 Years' War. And as a reward for his royal service, in 1358, he marries Philippa. He has his daughter married to, his son Edmund married to Philippa, daughter of Lionel, Duke of Clarence. So here's a family tree for you. So Usk has come through Elizabeth de Burgh here, and she's married Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and then their daughter Philippa then marries Edmund Mortimer, who is the son of Roger Mortimer, the second Earl. And at this time, it's not clear that she's going to be the great heiress that she ends up being. But Elizabeth de Burgh dies in 1363, I believe, and Lionel holds the lordship until his own death in 1368, basically. And Edmund Mortimer basically inherits the third of the Clare inheritance, which had come through that line at the time, basically. And it's at this point that Usk enters the picture. So we've already heard about the Clares and their control of Usk at this time, and its importance to them. As Kirsten said, it's quite a profitable lordship. It's worth about, so there's surviving accounts from this period during its control, and it's about £980 I calculated in total, but it could be more than that, 1,000. But I think this is pre-expenses as well, unfortunately. So it could be a little less than that, and as we'll see, this value dramatically increases later on. So, just moving on to what Usk looked like. So obviously we've seen this map. This is from a book called The Inheritances of Nobility in the 14th Century by a historian called George Holmes. And it's kind of entering its final form here. So in a lot of governmental records, Usk and Caerleon actually continue to be separated. But in the administrative accounts, receiver accounts, which actually do survive, it's quite clear that they are incorporated into one unit, one lordship at this time, with Usk being the primary nerve centre of the lordship through its administration, and its most important borough, its most important manor. So the manor itself is split into three components. So it's the manor, the borough, and the vill, which is, we're unsure, but it's probably the land surrounding it, which they could draw profits from as well. So now that we've gone through that, and just a little, Philip will be happy to hear that I've seen this map used loads at Leeds. I think it's becoming the new standard map for the Marches, which is fantastic. But so this is like the Mortimer's most southern manor lordship when it comes into their control. They also end up controlling Narberth and Pembrokeshire, most of the Middle March, and Denbigh up north. So you're just kind of getting a draw on how important they were in the Marches, basically. So, and Denbigh itself is the third most valuable lordship in the entire Marsh, and Usk comes a close fourth, I believe, in the statistics. But enough about boring economics. So, Usk is, in the records, is basically split into 11 manors, 3 boroughs, a vill, 4 Welsh beadleries and 2 forest jurisdictions. And the main lordship centred on Usk is basically where the Mortimers are spending a lot of their time when they inherit it. But they also do contain quite a strong economy at this time as well in the remainder of the lordship. So Usk remains controlled by the Mortimers directly at Fee Farm, and there's a strong milling economy here. But at Trellick they have a large flock of sheep. It's reckoned to be around 180 to 200, which they maintain as well. So it's got quite a diverse economy at this time. And that probably equates to why it's worth so much. The forests in particular, they're considered to be worth about £100 by themselves. So elsewhere in England, for example, the king has quite important authority over forests, and this kind of shows the power of Marcher lordship, that they're able to basically draw a lot of their revenue from control of these areas, basically. So let's now swiftly move on to the Mortimers at Usk. So it's quite clear that the Mortimers consider Usk to be quite an important part of their patrimony when it comes into their under their control. So Edmund Mortimer, the 3rd Earl, he appears to spend quite a bit of time at Usk because 2 of his children are born at Usk. So it appears that it can kind of continued as a residence for the countesses and the Earl. It's quite interesting actually looking at how Usk is kind of transforming at this period from like a military site to a more domesticated site, basically. And this isn't the only thing the Mortimers are doing here. So they are also involved in local society and patronage of local religious institutions. Also, one of the key chroniclers from this period, Adam Usk, sorry, it's quite obvious where he comes from, credits Edmund Mortimer with funding his education at Oxford, and he writes quite an important chronicle for the later 14th, early 15th century, which covers Glyn Dwr's rebellion, the events of Richard II's reign. So yeah, and that's all down to basically the patronage that he received from the Earls of March while they were lords of Usk. And also construction work, so Will's obviously gone over this quite a bit, but it's, researching this, it was difficult to ascertain what the Mortimers might have done at Usk. So I'm just going to be very tangential with this and be very diplomatic and say it's possible this is what they did. So it's possible that they made extensions to the gatehouse down here and were responsible for the building of the Dovecot Tower and rebuilding the walls in stone, I believe, in the outer ward, basically. They don't appear to have touched the inner ward too much. But especially with the Dovecot Tower, it's kind of suggesting that they're resident here, they're interested in increasing the comfortability that they have at Usk. So yeah, but it's unclear whether it is them or not. I'm more inclined to agree with John Kenyon, but you're free to disagree. So now moving on to the decline of Usk. So Usk is at the centre of several really important political events at the turn of the 15th century. So Roger Mortimer continued the Mortimer tradition of dying young, dies in Ireland, and leaves a 7-year-old son Edmund as his heir. So it's quite interesting that the Mortimer Earls are kind of absent from Glyn Dwr's rebellion. Obviously Sir Edmund Mortimer, who's the brother of this Earl, he ends up switching over to Glyn Dwr's side, but with the Mortimers being absent, the Crown has to take up the responsibility of protecting their important castles, and Usk is obviously one of them. But Usk is instead given to Eleanor, who's the late wife, as part of her 1/3 dower, and at this time it's valued at £466, 13 shillings and 4 pence. Now, as historians, we're always cautious of these evaluations in the Inquisition's post-mortem, because they're liable to bribery to try and decrease the value of the lordship, so the crown's less interested in exacting their revenues from it, basically. But I kind of think that we can consider these as like the bare minimum that this lordship is bringing in, basically. And £466 is quite a lot. That's the revenue of quite a well-off knight or a poorer baron, basically. And this is just one of the Mortimer lordships. And then Eleanor swiftly marries Edward Charlton, who becomes the Lord of Charlton himself in 1401, and they appear to be resident at Usk. Usk is the main part of her dower, and she seems to live here at this time. And at this time, Richard II, who has had a massive falling out of his nobles, this is very brief going over what happened here, he basically commits what's called the counter-appellant crisis, and he gets rid of a load of his political opponents in 1397 and then goes off to Ireland to enforce his lordship over there. One of the disenfranchised lords was a guy called Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of the Duke of Lancaster, and he'd basically been stuffed out of inheritance at the time. He comes back while Richard's in Ireland and starts rising up a rebellion, basically, and Richard can't get back in time to basically quell it, and he ends up losing his throne. And according to Adam Usk, who was an eyewitness and with the army of Henry Bolingbroke, he tells us that Henry comes to Usk and he actually faces one of the only instance of resistance during his entire rebellion, when Eleanor and Edward refuse to admit him. And it's unclear whether this is Adam Usk trying to basically implant himself in the wider history and saying, well, you know, I was important in this, but apparently he manages to convince Eleanor and Edward to surrender the castle and convince Edward to actually go with Bolingbroke to Chester, where he's basically chasing Richard II, because Richard II's going up the western coast of Wales, and he's basically going up the Eastern March, trying to intercept him. And then Henry Bolingbroke usurps Richard II and becomes Henry IV. And this is a very terrible time for England because it's massively destabilising. So what ends up happening with the Welsh, who were the cause of the Glyn Dwr rebellion, are very numerous and contested, and unfortunately I don't have time to go over them here. But they are widely considered to have been loyal to Richard II, who was very favourable towards Wales at this time. He basically retained the principality because he didn't have any kids, and he created an enlarged fiefdom up in Chester with the march connecting to that, and he was quite reliant on Welsh soldiers in his armies, basically, and they saw quite a lot of service under him. And when he's gone, it destabilises the region, essentially. So there's this guy called Owain Glyndwr. He's quite famous, you might have heard of him, and he basically rises up in 1400, and he raised the lands of his neighbour Lord Grey of Ruthin, and this is the triggering event of the Glyn Dwr rebellion. Originally the rebellions contained the Northern March, Northern Wales, but unfortunately Henry IV suffers a few really humiliating defeats. So one of them is the Battle of Bringlass, which Edmund Mortimer is captured at, and he eventually switches sides. This really puts him on the back burner, basically, and he can't galvanise enough support because he basically came to the throne on the platform of low taxation, because, you know, no one likes being taxed, basically. And so he can't get the support of his nobles, and he's seen as being very ostentatious as well. His household's like a really important burden on the kingdom, and he's accused of misappropriating funds, basically. And what this allows is Glyn Dwr to galvanise his support and then go on a bit of a murder spree. And in 1403, he basically marches down into southern Wales, and the rebellion comes to Usk, basically. And we know from Adam Usk that Glyn Dwr burns the town, the lordship, but does not take the castle at this time. And it's quite clear that there's concern amongst the king about protecting southern Wales, because he orders Edward Charlton to ensure the castle is garrisoned. And he actually says specifically in the order that he has to make sure that it's not taken by deception, because there's fear that the local Welsh might rise up as well. And this is clearly the case, because there are several entries in the patent fine and close rolls which make mention to orders trying to receive Welsh rebels into the king's peace, basically, saying to the king their forfeiture goods and lands. And unfortunately, that's not just it. So Usk is basically burnt at this stage, and a lot of its plots remain empty for 10 years after this event. And the rebellion then comes to Usk again in the Battle of Pwll Melyn. So this is probably the most important battle for the English in the rebellion, because it basically sucks all the energy away from the Welsh rebels. They lose the momentum which they had at this stage because the tactics change. So they basically march on Usk and they re-burn the town again, although there's not really much left to burn, and they attempt to take the castle. What ends up happening is the defenders then sally forth while they're retreating and catch them out in the open, and they just go through the rebels, basically. And they end up capturing Glyn Dwr's eldest son, Griffith, and they end up killing several really important commanders. So Glyn Dwr's brother is killed in this battle. I think it says Rhys Geffen's also killed in this battle. And also the abbot of John ap Pwll is his name, the abbot of Llantarnam. He dies while apparently administering to the wounded on both sides of the battlefield. And this is basically it for the rebellion. After that, it peters out. Obviously, there's no really official end date for the Glyn Dwr rebellion, because he kind of just disappears and becomes this mythological figure, essentially. But unfortunately, it's actually taken its toll on Usk. So for surviving accounts, unfortunately, they're not very. There's not many of them for the 14th, 15th century, but the numbers which we do see in the 1410s after this battle is that a lot of the plots are vacant, and the manor is considered only worth half of what it was originally worth. Unfortunately, we don't have numbers for the wider lordship, but if it follows a similar trajectory to other marcher lordships at this time, it's possible that as much as 30% of the economic output of the lordship was probably lost. And Usk really fails to recover after this, and it has a massive impact on the Earl of March when he finally comes into his inheritance after the reign of Henry IV is over, because he's kept as like a political prisoner because of his possible right to the throne of England. But that's a whole different matter, and I'm not going to go into that today. But yes, and that's the story of Usk under the Mortimers. Thank you.